Hello. Well, welcome to the Fuel Podcast. My name is Chris Papazis, and it's a great honor to be with you today. Now, this is a brand new podcast. This is only our second episode, and like I shared last time in my conversations with people, I've noticed that there is a strong hunger to talk about some of the deeper questions in life, some of the deep things in life. And they are hungry to find some answers to questions like, is there even a God? And if there's a God, what about the devil? What about life after death? Where is all this heading? Is everything just random? On and on it goes. There are a lot of questions out there. And so people really want to talk about these things, but the problem is that we've run into, in our society, we used to be able to talk about anything. But something has changed in the last 20 or 25 years or so. Something has changed. What's happened is our culture has gotten sensitive. We've gotten particularly sensitive in a politically correct fashion. And now it's difficult sometimes to talk about anything with any degree of depth or anything that has any degree of substance without somebody taking issue with it. And that's really not good, because a society, it's proven, benefits from the free exchange of ideas. The free and open exchange of ideas is critical. And so being oversensitive can make it hard to discuss some heavy topics, because there's a fear that sometimes even just to bring up a subject or ask a question is not a good thing. There's just a fear there. And so that's the purpose of this podcast. It's to ask those questions that people have and then answer them from a biblical perspective. I'm a pastor, so I answer from a biblical perspective, but to do so in a courteous and respectful manner. And that's what this is all about. One of the foundational verses of this podcast is 1 Peter 3:15, which tells us to always be ready to give an answer to anyone who asks you about the hope that you have. Be ready to give the reason for it, but do it gently and with respect. That's the key. We want to talk gently and with respect. So last time we just got our foot in the door, so to speak, for our first series. And if you remember, our first series is titled Sense and Nonsense, a biblical look at heaven and hell. And so what we're going to be doing is taking an in-depth look at this massive subject. And this subject is massive in its scope, because every person asks the question, what happens to me when I die? And we have established that really there is no greater question to answer. If heaven and hell are real, what more important subject is there that we can be discussing? And so now when we talk about heaven, it's really hard to go wrong. People generally agree that heaven is a good thing. And if they believe in heaven, they want to be there. Hell, on the other hand, is a minefield. For some, just the mere mention of it can cause a negative reaction. So like I said before, we need to talk about this gently and with respect, but also we need to be able to talk openly and honestly about it as well. So that's where we're at. And now on this episode, we are ready to start unpacking this topic. The title of our first discussion is going to be called The Make Your Own Heaven Game. The Make Your Own Heaven Game. If you talk to various people, there are a lot of different ideas about the subject of heaven. Some of those ideas line up with the Bible, but many ideas are actually contrary to Scripture. How did that happen? The place that we learned about heaven, now there's a lot of ideas about heaven that don't line up with it. So how did we get here? How did we get so many different views? What are those different views? How can we tell the difference? Well, it makes sense to start this discussion by talking about a guy that most of us have never even heard of, a guy that I had never heard of up until I did my study on this, and yet I was stunned to find that he has had more of an impact on what people believe on this subject than practically anybody else. It's a guy by the name of Emanuel Swedenborg. Emanuel Swedenborg was born in 1688. He was a very brilliant but very eccentric thinker of that time. And in some ways, we can say no person has impacted what people believe in the 21st century about heaven in a negative manner than he has. unfortunately. Many of his ideas about heaven have made their way into the theology of modern cults. Also, many of his ideas about heaven have made their way into Western and especially American culture. Now, to give you an idea on his impact, here are three of his ideas that, although you've probably never heard of him, you've probably heard of these ideas and maybe even have thought that they were true. The first idea that he brought out was that angels are human beings who have died and become perfect. This is really a very widely believed thought, but as we're going to see as we go forward in this study, angels are a completely separate class of beings. They are not, nor have they ever been human. They are a completely different species. And we're going to discuss why this is so significant in later shows. Another thing he taught is that he's the one that first taught that there are three heavens corresponding to your varying degrees of closeness with God. If you're very close to God, you'll be in the first heaven. And then if you're kind of close, you'll be in the second, and so on. This thought has made its way into Mormonism, but it is in fact not in the Bible. At least not in the way that Swedenborg said it was. More on that later as well. And then the third idea that he had is, and this one is extremely important, especially in the climate that we live in today. He said that people of all religions will go to heaven. Now, all three of these ideas are actually at odds with what Scripture teaches on the subject. So where did he come up with them? Listen to his answer to that question. Swedenborg said, and I quote, "It has been granted me to associate with angels and to talk with them as man with man, also to see what is in the heavens and what is in the hells, and this for 13 years. So now, from what I have seen and heard, it has been granted me to describe these." It's important to notice what he said. Did you catch where he said he got his revelation directly from angels? That is a red flag because the Bible is clear. If there is any revelation given from an angel that is contrary to Scripture, it is to be rejected completely. Listen to the strong condemnation from this kind of revelation from the Apostle Paul. You can look at this in Galatians chapter 1, verse 8. Paul is speaking here and he says, "But even if we or an angel from heaven should preach to you a gospel contrary to what we have preached to you, he is to be accursed." That's strong words. Revelation from angels that contradict Scripture are to be rejected. But that might lead us to ask the question, what kind of angel would teach something contrary to Scripture? That opens up a whole other can of worms because it brings up fallen angels. And we will be talking about that as we go forward as well. But suffice to say, based on this and other passages, we can dismiss Mr. Swedenborg's testimony about heaven. Furthermore, his teachings can be considered damaging in the sense that they actually lead people away from the truth rather than to it. Swedenborg's teachings are also damaging in another way that isn't quite as obvious, because his teaching leads to what we're calling the make your own heaven game. By taking away the Bible as the authority by which we get our understanding of heaven, he also gave license for other people to do the same. You see the slippery slope that he created? And we see its effect today. There are now many, many views that don't line up with Scripture. For example, Jehovah's Witnesses misteach that there are only 144,000 that go to heaven. The mind sciences view heaven as the unseen present dimension or presence of the divine mind in everything. Say what? In other words, heaven is just a state of mind. That's the mind sciences. The New Age movement has combined mind science with an imported brand of Hindu and Buddhist religious traditions that include reincarnation. The Bible teaches against reincarnation. Hebrews tells us that it is appointed for man to die once and then the judgment. There is no reincarnation. And we've even seen UFO cults who believe that heaven is in outer space or some planet. The Heaven's Gate UFO cult, if you remember that at the end of last century, they believed that there was a spacecraft trailing the Hale-Bopp comet, and 39 people tragically committed suicide as it neared, believing that By committing suicide, that was the only way for their souls to evacuate this earth and enter the spacecraft. That's just a small sample of the results of the Make Your Own Heaven game. Now, the authors of the book, Sense and Nonsense About Heaven and Hell, sum up this section by saying, if we are to know anything about heaven and hell, we need a truly reliable source. The only such source is the Bible. The reason is simply this. The Bible was inspired by the God of heaven, and its primary purpose is to reveal to us how we can live forever with that God. You know, we as humans, at our core level, we want to really know one thing. If there is a heaven, we want to know the way to heaven. And if we are to know anything about heaven, we need to hear from heaven. And we have heard. That's the big good news here. In God's revelation to us, we have been given all we need for this life and the life to come. And so that brings us to our conclusion of this episode. And to sum it up, what we can say is the sense and nonsense about this episode. The sense is this: the Bible will tell us everything that we need to know about heaven, what it is, how to get there, etc. Nonsense is this: whatever we want to believe about heaven is fine. So we're going to end on that note. Next week, the title of the show is going to be The First Person You Meet in Heaven. And this episode is going to be all about what Jesus had to say about the topic of heaven and hell. I think it's going to be very enlightening. It's going to be very thought-provoking. So I hope to see you then. I hope you have a great day. This is Pastor Chris. And until next time, may God richly bless you and yours. Have a great day.